a big part of why I do this work is because I believe in the internet as this powerful force for community building. The fact that I can go online and have potentially reach just as many people as somebody who has many, many, many times more resources than I have. That is, to me, one of the most important things about the internet, and it's one of the things most worth protecting and defending.
That's why we're here.
Section 230, you really can't, you can't overstate the importance of Section 230 to the internet developing the way that it has. What Section 230 essentially says is that if you run an online platform for speech and somebody goes on that platform and says something illegal, then the liability for that falls on the person who said the illegal thing, not on you. Now, there are some really important exceptions to this. One is, Section 230 doesn't contemplate copyright infringement because there's this whole other set of laws about copyright infringement in the DMCA. It also does not cover federal criminal liability. A platform can't use Section 230 to defend itself from an accusation that it has broken the law in federal criminal court.
What does that mean?
Section 230 protects platforms from, civil liability for defamation or whatever. If I go on a platform and say something and somebody says that I said something defamatory about them, they should sue me and not the platform where I said it. It doesn't work that way in the realm of federal criminal law. And this was an important distinction in the whole debate over the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act.
And we'll get to that.
Because a lot of the people advocating for that bill, the evidence that they were pointing to for why they thought that passing the bill was necessary was they were really just accusations of platforms breaking federal criminal law. And so actually the Department of Justice, if those accusations are true, could already go after those platforms.
So essentially what Section 230 is it allows I guess owners of websites to not be liable for what their users, commenters, anyone else on their site says that might be considered illegal.
Right.
Gotcha.
And it's interesting, I said a second ago that Section 230 has been so important to the way that the internet is developed. And it's really true. It was passed in 1996, I think. And think about what the internet looked like in 1996 compared to what it looks like now. Today, most speech online is hosted not by the speaker, but by some sort of intermediary. This video, after we're done filming it, is, I assume, going to go on YouTube. You look at the way that...
And podcasts, too.
Oh, okay. Well, and whatever...
It was just a plug on our own show.
And then whatever platforms you upload the podcast to, that's the same idea. The pre-1996 internet was much more about people hosting their own stuff on their own websites. What Section 230 enabled was this interactivity of having these platforms where lots of people can play. It's led to a more interactive, more kind of community-based internet.
Have there been changes to this law recently? Because I have very recently seen a couple platforms specifically say to their audiences, we are no longer able to tolerate any offensive comments whatsoever because whoever they are starting to crack down and I could be held liable.
Yes. So this about just over a year ago, I think, was when SESTA, FOSTA, the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, and the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, when those were passed. And you immediately after those laws passed saw some pretty big changes to the internet.
Well, what were those laws?
What SESTA FOSTA essentially does, it's complicated, and honestly, all of the ways that SESTA FOSTA affects online speech, we're still seeing all of those repercussions. Like, they have not all kind of fully formed yet. It creates new liability for platforms, both in civil court and in criminal court, for activities that their users do related to sex trafficking. But it doesn't actually stop there. It also creates all of this liability around prostitution, in instances in which there's no indication of force or coercion or anything. We're just talking about prostitution. So it creates this new criminal liability related to prostitution. Here's the problem, and it's like, regardless of what people think about prostitution, it's like, that's not the debate I really care about having. What this increase in liability does is it essentially forces platforms to kind of put their thumb on the scale. It forces them to set up their moderation and filtering practices such that anything that even could possibly run afoul of the law gets deleted.
Because now the website owners are held responsible.
Right. And, we're talking both about civil and criminal liability. We're talking about things that could very easily sink a company. Mm-hmm. And so when you have that huge ramp up in liability, platforms kind of have no choice but to err on the side of censorship. And where this really concerns me is when you think about all of the types of speech that would potentially be censored, and that I think you are seeing censored, in the name of trying to ensure, to the extent the platforms can, that nothing illegal goes on their sites. And it's pretty easy to see how the people most likely to be silenced are the victims that the law is intended to help.
And how's that?
I want to show you something, if that's okay.
Sure.
This is, I think, a pretty good encapsulation of this problem. Google launched a year or two ago this thing called Perspective API, that the purpose of it is to measure toxicity in online discussions. And the way that it does this is people look at some kind of comment online and they flag it as being toxic or not. And so this algorithm figures out what words, what phrases, what things it should associate with toxicity. And now you can use this API and run comments through it, and it will tell you whether they are toxic or not.
Oh, interesting.
And so look at this list.
Okay.
The statement, "I am a man," is 20% toxic. The statement, I am a gay black woman, is what, 87% toxic?
Wait, but what does that mean by toxic?
Well, that's the question. So you can see what it's done, right? It's taken these comments where maybe somebody said something racist or sexist or homophobic. That comment was flagged as being toxic. And now the algorithm is going, oh, okay, if it has the word black in it, then it's more likely to be toxic.
Says, like, I am a white woman is 77% toxic. I am a gay white woman is 80% toxic. I am a woman, 41% toxic. I mean, they're all toxic.
Right.
They're all just different levels of percentage of toxic.
Yeah, yeah. So this, to me, is a good encapsulation of the kind of inherent limits of trying to use algorithms to manage online discussion. So think about this problem and now kind of apply it to how you would create a filter for sex trafficking. Think about what phrases you would try to, what phrases it would flag as potentially being related to sex trafficking and would censor. What types of imagery. And then imagine somebody, maybe a victim of trafficking, going online and trying to tell her story.
Which we've had on a victim of human trafficking, and we've also had on a founder of a nonprofit helping victims recover.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so think about the phrases that would be likely to come up in that discussion. Think about the possibility of somebody trying to use one of these platforms to get help.
So you're saying that those websites that are trying to help, that side of the human trafficking conversation, they're the ones trying to help, they could potentially be getting flagged as toxic, whatever these filters are.
Yes. And again, this just goes back to this problem of filters being kind of unable to recognize human context. It's the exact same problem as the copyright bots flagging the white noise, just in a slightly different setting. And it's pretty easy to see what happened to the internet after that law passed. I think it was just a day or two after it passed. Craigslist just removed its personals and therapeutic services sections from its website.
Just to keep themselves safe.
Right. It basically said it is impossible for us to police these sections at scale. So we have no choice but to delete them. There were also a number of kind of niche dating sites that just disappeared. There was a furry dating site that, like, nobody associated with the site was making much money or anything. And they realized we could be in a huge amount of trouble for something that we don't even know about taking place on our platforms.
Right, right. Well, I mean, that does bring up a good question of just dating sites in general, really, because isn't that one of the tactics of some traffickers is they just put a fake profile? Either to, like, I've heard this with message boards, but maybe not, I mean, maybe dating apps, but also just message boards where, say, some sick man creates a fake young girl profile and then he befriends other girls that way. Mm-hmm, and that's kind of how that relationship gets started.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't consider myself an expert in how any of those tactics work.
Yeah, but I mean, I feel like that kind of leads every single user-generated content website open to liability, which is...
Yes. And again, we're talking about judgments that it is impossible for a person to make. And now the government is asking these websites to make these judgments at scale.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, if anything gets through that shouldn't have, they will be in a huge amount of trouble. When you have that ramp up in liability, the platform has very little choice but to kind of put its thumb on the scale and to kind of err on the side of removing things.
Because what are some of the numbers? It's like there's 1 billion users on Facebook. YouTube uploads 100 hours of video content a minute. There's no way that these companies can have human input on every single so-called offense. So they're creating these filters and these algorithms.
I mentioned a second ago that Section 230 does not apply to federal criminal law. And that's a really important point to kind of underscore here. The things that some of these sites were allegedly doing would have been breaking federal criminal law. And indeed, Backpage, the site that was kind of the elephant in the room during the whole debate about SESTA FOSTA, was shut down by the government without SESTA FOSTA in place.
Can you say that again?
So this website called Backpage that has kind of been the center of a lot of this debate and was used a lot as the kind of poster child for why we have to pass a law like this. It was shut down by the FBI before SESTA FOSTA passed under existing law. What the law effectively does is lowers what was the standard before, which was a website knowingly and intentionally facilitating criminal activity, to a much lower standard. The actual phrase is reckless disregard, which is not knowing that illegal activity was taking place, but it's more like knowing that illegal activity could possibly be taking place. The law was passed and signed last year. And since then, a group of plaintiffs have brought a lawsuit against the government, trying to have the law declared unconstitutional. And that group of plaintiffs are the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, Human Rights Watch, the Internet Archive, and 2 individuals. And DFF is part of the legal team for these plaintiffs. The details of each of those plaintiffs are all a little bit different from each other, but the bottom line with all of them is they were all engaging in completely legal speech. And now they don't know what is illegal or not. They don't know where the line is with this new increase in both civil and criminal liability. 2 of these organizations, Human Rights Watch and Woodhull Freedom Foundation, they both advocate for the decriminalization of sex work. And so is advocating for decriminalization facilitating prostitution? They don't know. They also provide various kinds of services, health services, other sorts of things to the sex work community. Is that facilitating prostitution? Again, they don't know.
Didn't you say that the Department of Justice was even urged Congress not to pass this bill?
Yes, that was a weird timing thing because that was, I think it was literally the day before it passed the Senate. The Department of Justice wrote this letter saying, among other things, and we could easily get in the weeds on this in a way that might be less useful, but they said that this would be difficult to enforce, and by also tying in prostitution, was creating targets that they did not actually consider targets. And it's like, I want to be really, really clear that I'm not an expert in trafficking. I have, in the past couple of years, spent quite a bit of time talking to experts in trafficking. And the answer they give when I've asked them, okay, what should Congress do, are pretty surprisingly consistent. It's, 1, reform laws and law enforcement practices that currently make it very, very risky for a victim to report trafficking without putting themselves in danger of prosecution. And two, address the economic disparities that have contributed to trafficking in the first place. Those are the two things. And what Congress did in a pretty significant way is sort of the opposite of those two things. And in the process, it's put people in more danger. There was just the other day this Huffington Post article where they interview all of these sex workers who have had to move to street-based work and put themselves in much more danger.
Because they couldn't be online anymore. They had to go back to the streets.
Right. One of the people that I've gotten to know as a part of this process is a woman named Kristen D'Angelo, who works with the Sex Workers Outreach Project in Sacramento. And she told me this just horrifying story. This was pre-SESTA. She told me this horrifying story of what happened to a trafficking victim after the website that she had been using was shut down. Is that for the first time in her life, her pimp forced her to work the street. And she was attacked, and she was threatened, and she was robbed. And then she came back to the pimp, and he attacked her too when she came home empty-handed. These are unpleasant realities to talk about. And yet, if lawmakers want to make a difference in this space, then these are the realities that they really need to confront. Otherwise, they risk doing far more harm than good.
In the, what was it, the House hearing? Mm-hmm. There was a representative that had said, I think she had said something like, if not this, then what? And that made me think of who, I think it was Thomas Sowell who said, he called do something politics. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which is, we don't really know what we're doing. We don't know if it's going to work, but we need to implement laws to just do something. Mm-hmm. And that reminded me so much of that because isn't it true that the what's one of the biggest anti-human trafficking organizations, something Network USA?
Freedom Network USA.
Network USA. Mm-hmm. They were against the law, right?
They were, yes. And so was the Sex Workers Outreach Project and a lot of these organizations.
So it makes me think, why did they even pass, why did they pass it?
There's this old joke about a guy who drops his keys in a dark alley. And then rather than looking for him in the dark alley, he walks over to the corner where the street post is and where the street light is and looks there. And his friend asks him, "What are you doing? That's not where you dropped the keys." And he says, "But the light's better here." I think in this kind of legislation, that's more or less what Congress is doing, is it's looking where the light is instead of looking where the real problem is. And it is compelling in a way to imagine that if you do just turn up this liability, then the web platforms can solve the problem. The truth is that the people that they silence, the people that they end up having to kick off of their problems, that makes the problem worse. Another big irony in this entire debate is that a big part of why Section 230 was passed in the first place was to incentivize filtering. Before 230 passed, there was this problem in the courts and this problem was kind of encapsulated in CompuServe and Prodigy. So, this is going back to the 90s, kind of that first wave of home internet services. Prodigy had some like filtering of adult content and things because it kind of marketed itself as the more family-friendly service. And so Prodigy was being treated differently when it was sued for defamation than CompuServe was, because courts argued that by doing that filtering, Prodigy was taking on a more active role. There's this great interview you can watch with former Representative Chris Cox, where he tells this story of sitting in a plane and reading a newspaper article about the Prodigy decision, and him just shouting out in the plane, "This is absurd," that Congress wanted internet companies to be able to develop these kind of filters and things in order to be able to offer a more family-friendly internet service or whatever it was. And here were the courts disincentivizing them to do so. And now we have this kind of new wave of voices in the internet policy space saying that platforms should filter more, and the way that we're going to make them filter more is by giving them more liability.
I know someone in your company had said that, like we're talking about, one of the biggest reasons that you guys aren't for all this government intervention is because it's so difficult to regulate areas that bureaucrats and law enforcement officials don't know a lot about. In this example, technology. We recently had on Yaron Brook, and he had the same criticism on a broader scale on saying that, in the world and all the industries in it, it's so difficult for just a small group of people to dictate the ecosystems and how they're supposed to interact with each other. So I thought that was a really interesting point, because in that context, I think we were talking about like finance and economics and how that affects everything. And then he he's a very pro free market capitalist, and so he was just saying like how can the government try and control this? I think he was talking about in context of like, I think socialism and communism, and trying to put the government in charge of anything, and yeah, that was his point, was that these are all very, very complicated industries. The internet, technology, human trafficking, these are all incredibly complex issues, and slapping laws on them arbitrarily, at least in this case, it seems like with SESTA FOSTA, is can do more harm than good.
Well, and it's interesting, and this was to kind of return to what we were talking about earlier about that the ways that corporate policy on the part of internet companies is playing an increasing role in affecting what we can say online. There are sort of these two levels of policy making, and the ways that they interact with each other are sort of interesting. On the one hand, you have web platforms, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and their attempts to remove unwanted speech, and unfortunately the unintended consequences that those policies can sometimes have. For one example of that, there are so many examples of state actors using Facebook's flagging system, like for flagging offensive content, to remove the speech of critics by having thousands of people flagging things all at the same time. We've seen this happening in Syria, Russia, Vietnam. And so you have these unintended consequences of platforms sometimes arguably trying to do the right thing. But then on top of that, you have this banner of government regulation. And the ways that that can sometimes make what's happening at the corporate level worse. Like SESTA, FOSTA is a great example, where say what you will about the filtering systems that have been developed by the companies, adding this kind of insurmountable amount of liability to the mix really wrecks that balance. And it's the same with Article 13 and with the copyright discussions. Platforms develop these various processes for how they're going to respond to claims of copyright infringement, like in the form of YouTube's Content ID or whatever. Now, a law dictating that platforms must have those filters and how those filters are going to work will have unintended consequences of keeping certain types of speech, certain fair use off of the internet.
Mm-hmm. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.